All right, so number one, what you're doing when you do these problems is you're trying to like get x by itself. So even though there's a square on the x, especially on 1, 2, and 3, you treat it kind of just like a regular x, and you get the x squared by itself. Okay? So if I was going to get x squared by itself on number 1, what would I do? Subtract 9. So I'm going to subtract 9 on both sides. All right, now my x squared is by itself. So what I do to figure out what x is I do the opposite of a square. So I do the square root on both sides. When you take the square root of something to solve an equation, you always put a plus or minus. Do we know the square root of 16? 4. We know it. So we go ahead and just say it's 4, and then we put plus or minus in front of it. There's no I on this one because there's not a negative in front of the 16. But if there is a negative, then you'd put an I. You do have to put the plus or minus because 4 times 4 is 16. But negative 4 times negative 4 is also 16. So when you solve these problems, all of them have a plus or minus somewhere. Okay? So number 2. What are you going to do on both sides? Add 6. Again, we're trying to get that x squared by itself. So just do it like you're solving a regular equation. Then what do you do?
Divide 3.
Divide by 3. Now, our x squared is by itself. So we take the square root on both sides. Put your plus or minus. Do we know the square root of 5? We don't know anything that multiplies to give me 5. That's exactly the same. It's 2.23 something, something, something. So you just leave it as square root of 5. Okay, so what are we going to do first on number 3? Add 8. What do I do next?
Divide 4.
Divide by 4. Now what?
Square root both sides.
This is going to have an I. I already know it.
It does, because there's a negative in there, we will have I, so it's plus or minus I, and then a square root of 5. And again, we don't know how to break down 5, so we leave the 5 there underneath the square root. So these are the kind of problems that you're going to have. You're going to have problems where there's regular numbers. So you're going to have problems where there's square roots, and you're going to have problems where there's square roots and i's or i's. Okay? So number 4, what's the difference in number 4 as compared to 1, 2, and 3? It has those parentheses.
You don't tell me you don't have to multiply that out.
We're not going to multiply it out. Although there is a way to solve it that way, that's not what we're doing here because we're trying to take square roots on both sides. Okay, so on 1, 2, and 3, how the x squared was by itself, and we got it by itself and then took the square root on both sides. You can only do that on 1, 2, and 3 because there's no other x's or anything like that in the problem. If there was more x's, then you'd have to do something different. On number 4, and then the rest of them, you see how there's always a parentheses with the square? There might be numbers added and subtracted. You're trying to get the parentheses part by itself. Okay? So, number 4, is the parentheses squared part by itself? It is. Okay, so there's nothing to do on that one. But see on 5 how you're going to have to add 21 and divide by 3 to get the parentheses by itself? That's what you're going to have to do. So you either try to get x squared by itself like you did on 1, 2, and 3, or you get the parentheses part by itself. Okay? Now, number 4, the parentheses part's already by itself, so what you're going to do is you're going to take the square root of the whole thing. The square root and the square go away. Over there on the left, Because when you take the square root of something squared, you get what you started with. So this is just x minus 2. Alright, then you do the square root of 25, which is 5.
5 with the I.
So it's plus or minus 5, and with an I, because the negative means an I.
I mean, X2. Oh, I just have this correct.
So now we're trying to get x by itself. After we get the square root away, and we've taken the square root, now we get x by itself, so then we add 2.
It would be 7I.
You leave it as plus or minus 5i plus 2. You can't combine the i's and the 2's because the 2 doesn't have an I with it. It's kind of like saying 5x plus 2, and you can't combine it. So you treat I like a variable. And that's it. That's the answer. See, we're trying to get the x minus 4 squared by itself. So think about the fact that I need to get this by itself. So we're going to add 21 first and then divide by 3. Okay? So, add 21. I think it is 108. And then you divide by 3. I think it's 36. Then you want to take the square root on both sides. So what's the square root of x minus 4 squared?
6.
Well, what happens with the square root and the square? So you get x minus 4 over here. Square root of 36 is 6. Don't forget your plus or minus. And I think this one's a little bit tricky because what happens is, at this point we want to add 4 on both sides. But because 6 is a regular old number and it has a plus or minus in it, what you have to do is you take the positive 6 and add 4, and then you take the negative 6 and add 4. So you get 10, and you get negative 2. And this is the only problem that you can work out completely. If it has i's in it, you leave it. If it has a square root in it, you leave it. But if, when you take the square root, you get a number, when you add or subtract a number, you actually get 2 numbers like this.
Wild.
So you subtract 9 first.
See?
And then you take the square root on both sides.
Yeah.
So what's the square root of 16?
4.
Plus or minus 4, right?
Yeah.
So because that's plus or minus 4, and then you're going to add 2 on both sides. So you get positive 4 plus 2, and you get negative 4 plus 2. Alright, so our first step on 7 is to add 80. So we get negative 8. Now I have the parentheses all squared by itself, so what do I do on both sides? Take the square root. So x plus 4 equals whatever the square root of negative 8 is. See, I don't know the square root of 8. Also, 8 is not prime. So I need to come out here to the side and I need to break down the 8. What can I divide 8 by? 2. And I get 4. Let's divide the 4 by 2 and we get 2. So we have a pair of 2's and a 2. So it would be 2 and then the square root of 2. And then the negative makes an I. Don't forget your plus or minus. You're not finished because x isn't by itself, so what else do you need to do? Subtract 4. So x equals plus or minus 2i square root of 2 minus 4. So, you're gonna add 16 first on number 8. And you're gonna divide by 2 next, because you're gonna get that part in parentheses squared by itself. So then that's when you take the square root on both sides. And when you take the square root in the square goes away. But now we have to break down the 28 because it's not a prime number. So we have a pair of 2's and a 7. So that means that you would have 2 square root of 7. Don't forget your plus or minus. And then what do you do for the final answer?
Subtract 1, or add 1 to
Add
both
1. So plus or minus 2 square root of 7 plus 1. Alright, so number 9. You're going to add 8 on both sides. And you're going to divide by 2. Now we have our part squared, so we can take the square root on both sides. Alright, the square root of negative 5
This is square root of negative 5.
is I and then square root of 5.
Yes.
And then for the final answer, you'll subtract 1. Don't forget your plus or minus. And that's your answer.